In early 1942, the northern coast of New Guinea shifted from a marginal colonial frontier to a central arena in the struggle for control of the Southwest Pacific. Before the war, Salamaua was a small administrative center and port on a narrow peninsula, supporting a modest European and Chinese community and serving nearby goldfields at Wau. Lae, about 35 kilometers to the north, was a larger commercial town and air hub. Both lay in the Australian-administered territory of New Guinea, where a small constabulary, the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles Militia, and scattered patrol posts represented Canberra's authority, but offered little capacity for sustained defense. For Tokyo, these coastal settlements became important once Japan seized Rabaul in late January 1942 and transformed it into a major air and naval base. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Fleet and the South Seas Detachment viewed Lae and Salamaua as forward bases to extend air cover southward, protect Rabaul, and prepare further moves toward Port Moresby and the Coral sea lanes between the United States and Australia. The invasion of Salamaua Lae, conducted from 8 to 13 March 1942 under the codename Operation SR, landed about 3,000 troops, principally elements of the 2nd Battalion, 144th Infantry Regiment, and a naval landing force, escorted by heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels. The small Australian garrison could not oppose such a force. Militia and a handful of regulars demolished key infrastructure, including the bridge over the Francisco River, and withdrew inland toward Mubo and Wau. Within hours, Japanese troops occupied Salamaua's airstrip and township and began preparing an airfield complex intended to support bombers and fighters operating against Port Moresby and Allied shipping. Allied commanders reacted with available long-range air power. On March 10, 1942, carrier aircraft from USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, supported by U.S. Army B-17s from Townsville and Royal Australian Air Force Hudson bombers from Port Moresby, crossed the Owen Stanley Range to strike the invasion shipping at Lae and Salamaua. The raid sank 3 transports and a minesweeper and damaged several escorts, at a cost of 1 U.S. aircraft destroyed and 2 aircrew killed. Nevertheless, the ground landings succeeded, and Japanese forces established themselves firmly in the area. In Tokyo's broader design, Salamaua Lae formed part of a chain of bases, including Tulagi and, ideally, Port Moresby, intended to extend a defensive perimeter and threaten Allied communications to Australia. After the March landings, Imperial General Headquarters confirmed a strategy that prioritized seizing Port Moresby and Tulagi, Operations MO and FS, to secure the approaches to the Central and South Pacific. The airfield at Salamaua Lae became one of several sites used to support air operations in this phase. For Australia, the occupation of Salamaua had both strategic and psychological implications. Strategically, it placed Japanese forces within a few hundred kilometers of Port Moresby, and within range of airfields that could threaten northeastern Australia and vital shipping routes. Psychologically, it demonstrated that an enemy power now held territory under Australian administration. Canberra and the Allied Southwest Pacific Area, command under General Douglas MacArthur, faced the dual task of defending Port Moresby and, in time, contesting Japanese control of the northern coast of New Guinea. Throughout mid-1942, both sides assessed the area differently. Japanese planners saw Salamaua primarily as an air and logistics base supporting the effort to capture Port Moresby, first by sea and then by the Kokoda track after the seaborne attempt was abandoned. Allied commanders, by contrast, viewed Salamaua and Lae as important but secondary objectives that would be addressed once the immediate threat to Port Moresby was contained. This divergence in priorities shaped the tempo of operations. Japan reinforced the garrison to secure the base, while the Allies relied initially on small, mobile forces rather than major formations. On the ground, the first sustained resistance took the form of irregular warfare. In April 1942, Australia formed Kanga Force, a composite group built from the 5th Independent Company and the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles, around 700 men on paper and approximately 450 effective combatants. Operating from Wau and inland bases, Kanga Force conducted reconnaissance and small-scale raids along the Huon Gulf. Their activities were constrained by limited airlift capacity, shortages of heavy weapons, and the need to move all supplies along narrow mountain tracks or by small aircraft into rough airstrips. The raid on Salamaua on 28th to 29th of June 1942 illustrated both the possibilities and limits of this approach. About 70 Australian commandos and militia, guided by local knowledge and New Guinea volunteer rifle scouts, infiltrated close to the Japanese perimeter and launched coordinated attacks on the airfield, wireless masts, and nearby positions. They killed more than 100 Japanese personnel while suffering only a few wounded, and captured documents revealing Japanese plans for future landings at Buna and Milne Bay. These intelligence gains helped Allied commanders redeploy forces in time to meet later operations in Papua. By late 1942 and early 1943, the strategic environment around Salamaua had changed. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby along the Kokoda track had been halted, and battles at Milne Bay and Bunagona had demonstrated that determined Allied forces, supported by growing air power, could defeat Japanese ground formations. At the same time, Japan's logistical capacity in New Guinea was constrained by shipping losses and the limited throughput of small coastal convoys. Even so, the Salamaua region housed a significant Japanese presence. Logistical limitations capped the area's garrison at around 10,000 personnel, about 7,500 soldiers and 2,500 Navy and support troops, while Allied planners were already considering operations that would eventually deploy roughly 30,000 Australian and U.S. troops against these positions. In this context, the Battle of Salamaua that unfolded between 1942 and 1943 emerged from overlapping calculations. For Japan, holding Salamaua meant maintaining a forward base that still supported New Guinea operations and protected Rabaul's southern approaches. For Australia and the United States, Salamaua became both a symbol of enemy occupation on Australian-administered soil and a potential lever. Pressure against Salamaua might draw Japanese reinforcements away from other objectives, especially Lae, and gradually shift the balance of the campaign in New Guinea. By early 1943, Salamaua was no longer just an occupied coastal settlement, but a defined sector in two opposing operational systems. On the Japanese side, responsibility for the area rested with the 18th Army under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, headquartered at Madang and reporting to the newly formed 8th Area Army at Rabaul. Local ground forces around Salamaua and Lae were composed mainly of elements of the 51st Division and attached units, infantry regiments, engineers, service troops, and naval-based personnel. Their positions extended from the coastal strip around Salamaua, north toward Lae and inland, along tracks to Mubo and Komiatum, where small outposts guarded approaches from the interior plateau around Wau. Opposite them, Allied control of inland New Guinea tightened. New Guinea force, headquartered at Port Moresby, and nominally under Australian command, but integrated into General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area, began transitioning from a reactive defense to planned offensive operations. The core maneuver formation for the Salamaua sector would be the Australian 3rd Division under Major General Stanley Savage, supplemented by independent companies already in the area, and, later, by elements of the U.S. 41st Infantry Division, providing support north of Lae. Air support was organized through the Royal Australian Air Force and United States Army Air Forces units within 5th Air Force, which operated from Port Moresby, Milne Bay, and emerging forward airstrips. The first major clash that signaled a new phase occurred not on the coast, but in the highlands around Wau in January 1943. Seeking to secure a springboard for further advances, Japanese planners dispatched a reinforced force, roughly a regiment group, south from Salamaua and Lae, along tracks through the Black Cat area, and down toward Wau. Their aim was to capture the airfield, which functioned as a key hub for Australian reinforcement and supply, and from there to threaten the Bololo and Upper Markham valleys. The approach march, conducted through steep jungle ridges under monsoon conditions, immediately exposed the logistical difficulties of operating in this terrain. Every artillery piece, mortar round, and ration had to be moved by hand or pack animal along narrow paths. Australian commanders understood that the airfield's runway was the decisive factor. They concentrated limited transport aircraft to bring in companies and battalions of the 17th Brigade under difficult conditions, landing under intermittent fire, and with the Japanese advance only a few kilometers away. The fighting around Wau from late January into early February saw Japanese units attempt to seize the airstrip from the surrounding hills, while Australian infantry defended a perimeter anchored on the runway and nearby features. Although air attacks and ground fire inflicted damage on the landing ground, Allied aircraft continued to deliver troops and supplies, ensuring that local numerical balance shifted in favor of New Guinea force as the battle continued. The checked Japanese offensive against Wau altered perceptions on both sides. For Adachi's 18th Army, it demonstrated that inland advances from Salamaua and Lai toward the highlands were possible, but required greater manpower and logistical preparation than initially estimated. For Allied commanders, the successful defense confirmed that air supply and rapid reinforcement could offset difficulties posed by terrain and weather. It also showed that offensive operations against the Salamaua-Lai coastal strip could be mounted from the Wau Plateau once suitable forces were assembled. In the months that followed, both command systems adjusted. Japanese staff officers refined plans for the defense of Salamaua, emphasizing strong points on high ground, such as Mubo, Lababia Ridge, and Komiatum Ridge to block approaches from Wau. They also requested additional units to strengthen the coastal garrison, although shipping constraints and air interdiction limited what could be delivered. Meanwhile, New Guinea force began to plan a deliberate advance from Wau towards Salamaua, using the existing independent companies as reconnaissance and flank guards, and preparing infantry brigades for sequential attacks down the ridgelines. This convergence of planning and force movements marked the opening phase of what would become the protracted Battle of Salamaua in 1943. For Allied planners in early 1943, Salamaua was never an isolated objective, but part of a broader design to roll back Japanese bases along the Huon Gulf and ultimately to isolate Rabaul. Within General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area, this design took shape as Operation Cartwheel, a sequence of overlapping offensives intended to neutralize major Japanese strongpoints without frontal assaults wherever possible. Lae, with its larger port and airfield potential, was defined as the primary objective. Salamaua, smaller and more exposed, was assigned a different role, to absorb Japanese reinforcements and attention, so that the later assault on Lae could proceed under more favorable conditions. Under New Guinea force, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Edmund Herring, and including Australian the Furry Corps, detailed planning translated this concept into concrete tasks. The Australian 3rd Division under Major General Stanley Savage would advance from Wau towards Salamaua along the inland ridges, using its brigades and independent companies to apply constant pressure on Japanese positions at Mubo, Lababia Ridge, and Komiatum. In parallel, arrangements were made to land U.S. Army units of the 41st Infantry Division on the coast south of Salamaua at Nassau Bay to open a shorter seaborne supply route to the front and to secure the coastal flank. The eventual seizure of Lae was planned as a separate but synchronized operation involving amphibious landings by the Australian 9th Division east of Lae and an airborne landing by the U.S. 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment at Nadzab to the west. Force ratios and casualty expectations formed part of this planning. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese strength in the Salamaua-Lae area was constrained by logistics to roughly 10,000 personnel, about 7,500 Army troops and 2,500 naval and support staff, centered on the 51st Division's Okabe detachment. Against this, the Allies expected to employ around 30,000 troops over the course of the campaign, including several Australian divisions and attached U.S. units. The intention was not to bring all of these formations simultaneously against Salamaua, but to use a series of limited offensives to wear down the garrison, while preparations for the larger Lae operation and follow-on Huon Peninsula actions went ahead. Logistics dominated Allied staff work. Air transport had already proven decisive at Wau, but planners recognized the limitations of relying solely on C-47s over mountain ranges subject to sudden weather changes. Work continued on improving overland routes such as the Bulldog track from the south, intended eventually to support heavier equipment into the Markham Valley, although progress was slow and the road would not be ready in time to support the initial Salamaua drive. To shorten supply lines, engineers and naval units planned the Nassau Bay landing to establish a beachhead from which small craft could shuttle ammunition, rations, and reinforcements directly to the advancing Australian brigades. Indigenous carriers from Papua and New Guinea, already integral in previous campaigns, were again factored into plans to move supplies on the last, steep segments of the tracks. On the Japanese side, strategic thinking was shaped by the need to hold a shrinking but still valuable perimeter. The 8th Area Army at Rabaul, under General Hitoshi Imamura, and the 18th Army under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi identified Salamaua and Lae as essential outposts, shielding the approaches to the Vidiaz Strait and the northern New Guinea coast. After the failed attempt to capture Wau and the heavy losses suffered by the 51st Division during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, Japanese staff officers revised their expectations. They concluded that large seaborne reinforcement convoys from Rabaul were too vulnerable to Allied air attack, and that future movements would have to rely on smaller barge traffic along the coast or arduous overland routes. Defensive plans therefore emphasized fortifying key terrain features near Salamaua, rather than relying on frequent troop rotations from the rear. Japanese doctrine in the area translated into an interconnected ring of strongpoints, bunkers and trenches on ridges like Mubo and Mount Tambu, supported by mortars and machine guns, sited to force attacking troops into narrow approaches where pre-registered artillery and grenade fire could be concentrated. Night movements, camouflage, and dispersed bivouacs aimed to reduce vulnerability to Allied air attacks. At the operational level, the intention was to delay any Allied advance from Wau for as long as possible, inflict attrition out of proportion to the local garrison's numbers, and preserve enough strength around Lae to contest, or at least complicate any future amphibious landing. Both sides made assumptions that would influence the unfolding campaign. Allied planners believed that sustained multi-brigade operations against Salamaua, supported by growing air superiority, would compel the Japanese to divert substantial forces from Lae, thereby weakening that primary base ahead of Operation Postern. Japanese commanders, aware that Salamaua's terrain favored defense, expected that they could hold with comparatively fewer troops, and that Allied logistics through Wau would limit the scale and tempo of attacks. Neither expectation proved entirely accurate. The Allies underestimated the time and effort required to fight along successive ridgelines, while the Japanese underestimated the degree to which Allied air and naval mobility could compensate for difficult ground. These miscalculations became apparent as the first major engagements of the Salamaua Drive began in April 1943. In April 1943, the advance from Wau towards Salamaua shifted from planning to execution. The Australian 3rd Division began to push small columns down the network of jungle ridges that formed the inland axis of approach. Battalions such as the 2/3, 2/5, and 2/7, averaging around 600 to 700 men each when reinforced, moved out from established positions near Wau, along tracks that descended toward Mubo and Bob Doobie Ridge. Their first tasks were limited: patrol aggressively, test Japanese outposts, and identify routes where artillery and supplies might eventually follow. The emphasis was on learning the ground and probing the defensive belt that the Japanese had built to shield Salamaua from an inland assault. The Japanese positions these patrols encountered were parts of an interconnected system established after the failed Wau offensive. Units of the Okabe Detachment, drawn mainly from the 102nd Infantry Regiment and supporting elements, held strong points on features such as Observation Hill, Guadagasal, and points along the Baitoy and Mubo valleys. These positions typically consisted of log and earth bunkers dug into slopes, with firing lanes cut through the jungle to cover likely avenues of approach. Mortars and machine guns were sited to overlap. Patrols that advanced too far down a spur often found themselves under fire from several directions, revealing how carefully the defenders had integrated terrain into their plans. The first serious engagements developed as these reconnaissance efforts turned into deliberate attacks. In late April and early May, Australian companies pushed against the forward defenses near Mubo, aiming to secure high points that overlooked tracks and creek crossings. These company and battalion attacks rarely involved more than a few hundred men on each side at any one time, yet they consumed considerable resources. Moving ammunition, food, and medical supplies forward required lines of native carriers, often recruited from the same villages over which the fighting passed. Casualties from illness, including malaria and dysentery, began to rise alongside battle wounds, affecting both Allied and Japanese units and reducing effective strength even when nominal numbers appeared unchanged. Air power accompanied these first engagements but did not decisively break the ground defenses. Aircraft from the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force conducted bombing and strafing runs against suspected Japanese positions around Salamaua, Mubo, and Komiatam. Medium bombers such as B-25s and A-20 attacked supply dumps and bivouac areas, while fighters, including P-40 Paces, flew close support and interdiction missions. For the ground troops, airstrikes offered psychological reassurance and could disrupt enemy movements, but the dense canopy and deeply dug bunkers often limited the physical damage. Japanese units adapted by dispersing during the day, improving camouflage, and concentrating for counterattacks under cover of darkness or heavy rain. On the Japanese side, local commanders read these early attacks as evidence that the Allies were serious about an advance on Salamaua, but were still constrained by logistics. Reports to 18th Army headquarters described Allied tactics as methodical but slow, with repeated small-scale attacks and frequent pauses. This reinforced the belief that strong points on key ridges could hold out if adequately supplied and supported by artillery from rear positions. At the same time, Japanese officers noted increasing air activity and the growing presence of Allied artillery, indicators that the enemy's capacity in the WoW sector was expanding rather than diminishing. For the local civilian population, these first engagements marked the transition from intermittent patrol activity to a more continuous front. Many villages near the tracks were evacuated or relocated under guidance from Australian authorities or mission personnel, while others were drawn into Japanese labor schemes to carry supplies or build fortifications. In some areas, the same communities interacted with both sides at different times, providing carriers or guides under varying degrees of coercion or obligation. Their experience of the campaign was not defined by front lines in the conventional sense, but by the presence or absence of armed parties on a given day, and by the disruption of traditional movement and subsistence patterns. By June 1943, the pattern of the campaign around Salamaua was clear. Allied forces were pressing slowly but steadily down the inland approaches, seizing limited objectives such as individual ridges or knolls, and then consolidating before moving again. Japanese defenders were trading space for time, withdrawing from untenable forward positions, while reinforcing others closer to Salamaua itself. Casualty figures remained relatively limited in absolute terms at this stage, often dozens rather than hundreds in individual actions. But the cumulative effect was growing. Losses among experienced non-commissioned officers and junior officers on both sides began to alter unit cohesion, while the continuous strain of operations in steep, waterlogged terrain affected morale and physical endurance. These early engagements set the conditions for the larger clashes that would follow as both sides committed additional forces to the Salamaua sector. By mid-June 1943, the campaign around Salamaua entered a phase of sharp escalation. Both command systems sought to break what had become a grinding series of small engagements. Japanese headquarters at Lai and Salamaua committed one of their few available reinforcement formations, the 66th Infantry Regiment, about 1,500 men in 2 battalions, to a counteroffensive aimed at restoring the initiative and driving the Australians away from the approaches to the coast. Their chosen objective was Lababia Ridge, a narrow, steep position roughly 20 kilometers south of Salamaua that dominated tracks between Mubo and the Bitoy River. Lababia Ridge was held by a compact Australian force, D Company of the 2nd 6th Infantry Battalion, reinforced by a platoon and anti-tank section, totaling around 150 personnel. Between 20th and 23rd June, this company-sized garrison faced repeated assaults by elements of the 66th Regiment. Japanese infantry attempted to envelop the ridge from several directions, using infiltration through kunai grass and jungle to reach positions close to the Australian trenches before launching grenades and close-range fire. The defenders, who had deliberately cleared fields of fire at the cost of concealment, relied on interlocking machine gun posts, mortars, and coordinated small arms fire to break up attacks before they could overrun the crest. Air support influenced the battle's outcome, but did not remove the strain on ground troops. During critical phases, Allied aircraft, Beaufighters, and other types strafed Japanese movement corridors along the approaches to the ridge. For the defenders, the sight and sound of friendly aircraft offered reassurance that higher command was aware of their position. For Japanese troops, low-level air attacks complicated efforts to regroup or reposition. However, the dense vegetation and rugged slopes still allowed many attacking groups to assemble for renewed assaults. By the end of 4 days, the Australians had recorded 11 killed and 12 wounded, while Japanese losses were estimated at 41 killed and 131 wounded, with additional casualties likely uncounted in the surrounding jungle. From the Japanese perspective, the Lababia operation revealed both the possibilities and limitations of local counterattacks. A regiment-sized commitment had been required to challenge a company on a single ridge, and even then, the objective remained in Australian hands. Reports to 18th Army under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi emphasized the determination of Allied defensive tactics and the increasing role of air power. At the same time, Japanese staff officers could claim that their counteroffensive had at least disrupted Allied preparations, and signaled that further advances towards Salamaua would be contested vigorously. For Australian and U.S. planners, the fighting at Lababia underscored a developing logistical crisis. Every additional platoon sent forward from Wau increased the burden on air transport and carrier columns, while the need to maintain garrisons on exposed ridges tied down infantry that might otherwise have been concentrated for larger operations. To sustain a higher tempo of operations and bring artillery and heavier equipment to bear, New Guinea Force concluded that a shorter supply route was necessary. This requirement led directly to the decision to seize Nassau Bay, a strip of coast about 24 kilometers south of Salamaua, and convert it into a forward supply point for the Salamaua Drive. The amphibious operation at Nassau Bay, planned as part of the broader Cartwheel concept, was entrusted to a composite formation known as Makishni Force. Its core was the reinforced 1st Battalion, 162nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 41st Infantry Division, supported by Australian 2 6th Battalion elements, Papuan Infantry Battalion companies, and U.S. Engineer boat units. In total, about 1,400 Allied personnel were assigned to the landing and immediate consolidation. Opposing them were roughly 600 Japanese troops from 3rd Company, 102nd Battalion and 3rd Company, 66th Infantry Regiment, distributed between the bay itself, Cape Dinga, and positions along the Baiktoy River. On the night of 30 June to 1 July 1943, Makishni Force embarked in a mixed flotilla of 3 PT boats, almost 30 landing craft, and 2 captured Japanese barges. Heavy surf, rain, and poor visibility scattered the formation, drove many craft ashore, and wrecked a significant proportion of the landing fleet. Despite these difficulties, around 770 U.S. troops from the first waves came ashore largely unopposed, supported by Australian guides marking the beaches and Papuan patrols covering the flanks. Most radios and a quantity of equipment were lost in the surf, forcing local commanders to reconstruct communications and fire support arrangements from whatever could be salvaged. Once the Japanese command realized that a permanent beachhead was being established, local units mounted night attacks against the perimeter. For many U.S. soldiers, these engagements constituted their first combat experience. The defenders, U.S. infantry, Australian detachments, and engineer personnel, hastily organized into rifle groups, repelled infiltration attempts and frontal probes with rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. Over the course of several days, Allied casualties at Nassau Bay amounted to 23 killed and 27 wounded. Japanese losses were estimated at around 76 killed in and around the beachhead. The combined effect of the Lababia counterattack and the Nassau Bay landing marked a clear escalation in the Salamaua sector. Japanese forces had demonstrated their willingness to commit full regiments to offensive action, but had not regained key terrain. Allied forces had opened a new coastal axis of advance and a shorter supply line, at the cost of landing craft and the exposure of U.S. units to sustained ground combat and tropical disease. For local communities along the coast and inland tracts, these developments brought intensified movement of troops, increased demands for carriers and labor, and greater disruption of agriculture and trade. The front was no longer confined to discrete ridges or villages. It now extended from Wau across the interior to a growing Allied enclave on the Huon Gulf, setting the stage for larger operations aimed directly at Salamaua and, beyond it, Lae. From early July 1943, the Salamaua sector moved into its most intensive phase as Allied forces along both inland and coastal axes began to operate in concert. The Australian 3rd Division now controlled a chain of positions from Wau down to Mubo, Lababia Ridge, and the Baitoi area, while the newly established U.S. beachhead at Nassau Bay allowed supplies and reinforcements to flow in by sea. The inland formations and the coastal contingent were linked by patrols and shared artillery plans, turning previously separate efforts into a single coordinated advance towards Salamaua. The inland thrust focused first on Mubo. Battalions of the 17th Brigade pressed against Japanese positions that had been held, abandoned, and reoccupied several times since the early probing attacks. Assaults were launched along steep, narrow spurs, where each knoll or saddle had to be taken individually by platoon and company groups. Fire support came from mortars and field guns, emplaced on limited patches of level ground, often several kilometers to the rear, with forward observers working from exposed vantage points to direct bombardments onto bunker complexes. As pressure mounted, Japanese units at Mubo withdrew gradually toward higher ground near Komiatum and Mount Tambu, trading terrain for prepared positions closer to Salamaua. On the coastal side, U.S. and Australian troops moved north from Nassau Bay along the shore and parallel inland tracks. Elements of the U.S. 162nd Infantry advanced toward Tambu Bay, while Australian companies pushed inland toward Bob Doobie Ridge, a long, forested high feature that dominated approaches from both sea and interior. Here, Japanese defensive planning was particularly evident. Positions were located on reverse slopes, communication trenches linked weapon pits, and small counterattack groups were held ready in covered assembly areas. Fighting on Bob Doobie involved repeated local attacks and counterattacks, with companies losing and retaking the same sections of ridge in engagements that sometimes lasted several days. The combined effect of these moves was to create a multi-pronged threat to Salamaua. Japanese commanders had to allocate limited reserves between defending Mount Tambu and Komiatum, reinforcing coastal positions opposite Nassau Bay, and maintaining a minimal garrison in Salamaua itself. Requests for additional troops competed with demands from Lae and other sectors, and the difficulties of moving personnel and supplies along barge routes or mountain tracks meant that reinforcement arrived slowly and in small groups. As a result, individual infantry companies and platoons often held stretches of front that would normally have been assigned to much larger formations. Air and artillery fire reached their greatest intensity of the campaign during this period. Allied medium and light bombers struck identified defensive lines, supply dumps, and movement routes on an almost daily basis when weather allowed. Fighters flew escort, reconnaissance, and ground attack sorties, seeking to disrupt Japanese attempts to shift forces laterally between threatened points. On the ground, artillery batteries engaged in counter-battery fire when Japanese guns revealed their positions, and laid down preparatory bombardments before infantry attacks on major objectives such as Mount Tambu or key sections of Bob Doobie Ridge. Japanese artillery and mortars responded where they could, but shortages of ammunition and the need to conceal gun positions limited their ability to match the scale of Allied fire. For the soldiers involved, this phase meant sustained operations with limited respite. Infantry units rotated through forward positions, but the depth of the front and the effort required to move even short distances over ridges and through ravines meant that rest areas were often only a few kilometers behind the line, and still subject to air attack, shelling, and disease. Casualty lists for July and August show a marked rise in killed and wounded on both sides, while medical reports record significant numbers of personnel evacuated for malaria, scrub typhus, and other tropical illnesses. The effective strength of many battalions was reduced by these non-combat losses even when nominal manpower figures remained close to establishment. Civilian conditions deteriorated further as the campaign reached its peak. Villages along the coastal track between Nassau Bay and Salamaua were repeatedly occupied by different forces, used as forward supply points, and sometimes abandoned or destroyed to deny shelter to the opposing side. Food gardens were left untended or trampled by troop movement, and traditional trade routes between inland and coastal communities were disrupted. Many local men were engaged as carriers, moving supplies or evacuating wounded for one side or the other, usually under formal arrangements, but sometimes under pressure. Mission stations and administrative posts that had once provided basic services now functioned primarily as staging points or medical posts for the military. By late August, the cumulative result of this peak period was visible on the campaign map. Allied forces stood much closer to Salamaua, controlling Bob Doobie Ridge and positions within striking distance of Mount Tambu and Komiatum. Japanese units, though still holding a continuous line, had been pushed back onto a narrower perimeter that covered the direct approaches to the town. Both commands recognized that the sector had reached a critical juncture. For the Allies, the question was how to convert local gains into the capture of Salamaua without overextending forces needed for the forthcoming Leh operation. For the Japanese, it was whether holding Salamaua justified the growing strain on units already weakened by combat and supply shortages. These unresolved issues set the stage for the next phase, in which adaptation and reallocation of resources would become as important as direct combat in determining the outcome. As the pressure on Salamaua increased in August 1943, both sides shifted from expansion of operations to adaptation under strain. Japanese units facing the inland advance around Komiatum and Mount Tambu adjusted their defensive methods to cope with limited manpower and sustained bombardment. Company and platoon positions were broken into small, mutually supporting groups, rather than continuous trench lines. Communication trenches were deepened, bunkers were reinforced with additional timber and earth, and weapon pits were relocated to secondary sites so that artillery-registered coordinates would no longer match the actual gun and mortar locations. Movement between positions took place almost entirely at night, with small parties carrying ammunition and rations under strict light and noise discipline. Australian and U.S. troops modified their tactics in response. Assaults that had previously focused on frontal advances up ridges increasingly relied on flanking probes along lesser-used spurs or on infiltration by small groups to establish footholds behind key Japanese points. Platoons were reorganized to emphasize light machine guns, grenades, and close support mortars for fighting at short range among logs and tree roots. Forward observers for artillery and aircraft learned to work from concealed positions on reverse slopes, adjusting fire based on sound and glimpses through the canopy, rather than clear visual observation. This interplay of adaptation, defenders dispersing and concealing, attackers refining methods to find and fix them, characterized much of the fighting in the final approach to Salamaua. Logistical adjustments were equally significant. On the Allied side, the opening of Nassau Bay as a supply point reduced reliance on long, vulnerable air supply lines from Wau. Small coastal vessels and engineer boat units developed a routine of night runs between rear bases in the bay, unloading ammunition, food, and medical supplies that were then moved forward by Papuan and New Guinean carrier lines, and by limited numbers of pack animals. Medical services adapted with forward dressing stations, established closer to the front, reducing the time wounded personnel spent on these improvised stretchers along steep tracks. Anti-malarial discipline was reinforced through routine distribution of drugs and stricter enforcement of mosquito net and clothing regulations, although compliance varied under operational pressure. Japanese logistics, already stretched, required more drastic improvisation. With large convoys deemed too vulnerable, small barges and coastal craft attempted to move supplies from Loy and Finschhafen towards Salamaua under cover of darkness and bad weather. Losses to air attack and mechanical failure meant that units near the front increasingly relied on ration reductions and foraging. Rice and tinned foods were supplemented by local produce obtained from gardens or requisitioned from villages. Ammunition expenditure was carefully controlled. Machine gun bursts were limited, and mortars were often held for prearranged defensive fires rather than used in prolonged exchanges. Morale on both sides reflected this continuous adaptation under difficult conditions. Allied infantry reported fatigue from repeated attacks up steep slopes and from prolonged exposure to rain, mud, and disease, but also drew confidence from the visible presence of supporting artillery and aircraft, and from the knowledge that supply routes were gradually improving. Rotation schemes, even when limited in scope, allowed some units short periods away from the most exposed positions. For Japanese troops, morale was influenced by a combination of strong unit cohesion, emphasis on duty and perseverance, and growing awareness of the material imbalance. Letters and diaries from surviving accounts describe confidence in the strength of their positions, alongside concerns about shortages and the increasing frequency of air raids. Local communities also adapted to the prolonged presence of armed forces. Some villages shifted cultivation areas away from main tracks to reduce the likelihood of crops being taken by passing troops. People developed routines for quickly hiding tools, valuables, and sometimes younger family members when patrols were reported nearby. Individuals serving as carriers or guides for one side often had to balance obligations and risks associated with the other, navigating a landscape in which control could change repeatedly within short distances. Their decisions about cooperation, avoidance, or quiet resistance were shaped by immediate survival needs, rather than by the broader strategic aims of either belligerent. Within the higher commands, adaptation took the form of resource reallocation. Allied headquarters weighed the demands of Salamaua against preparations for the forthcoming Leh offensive, adjusting artillery priorities, air tasking orders, and reinforcement schedules as information from the front arrived. Japanese 18th Army and 8th Area Army staffs reassessed whether Salamaua could continue to function as a viable forward base, or whether its main purpose had become to delay Allied operations and absorb pressure that might otherwise fall directly on Leh. These calculations, informed by reports of losses, supply rates, and the state of defensive works, prepared the ground for decisions that would soon alter the course of the campaign. The turning point in the Salamaua campaign emerged in late August and early September 1943, when local ground gains intersected with wider operational moves against Leh. After months of incremental advances, Australian forces of the 3rd Division and attached units broke through the last substantial defensive belt in front of Salamaua. The 58th 59th Infantry Battalion succeeded in crossing the Francisco River on 21st August, securing a foothold on the far bank that had previously marked a key terrain obstacle for both sides. From this bridgehead, Australian infantry moved onto higher ground overlooking the approaches to the town. The main Japanese defensive position on this final line was a complex around a feature known as Charlie Hill, supported by bunkers and firing pits sited to cover the river crossings and nearby spurs. In the first week of September, elements of the Australian 42nd Infantry Battalion, supported by artillery and airstrikes, attacked and captured Charlie Hill after close-range fighting. The loss of this position deprived the Salamaua garrison of much of its depth in front of the town and made further delay operations increasingly difficult. For Japanese troops on the ground, the withdrawal toward the immediate outskirts of Salamaua meant abandoning positions that had been prepared and improved over many months. At almost the same time, the broader Cartwheel plan reached its decisive execution phase against Leh. On the 4th of September, 1943, the Australian 9th Division conducted an amphibious landing east of Leh as part of Operation Postern, coming ashore on beaches near Malahong with artillery support from U.S. destroyers. The following day, 5th of September, the U.S. 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, together with Australian artillery detachments, carried out an airborne landing at Nadzab in the Markham Valley, securing an airfield that allowed the Australian 7th Division to be flown in. These moves threatened Lae from both east and west, creating a pincer that could cut off Japanese forces withdrawing along the coastal corridor. For the Japanese 18th Army under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi and the local commander, Major General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division, the combination of setbacks near Salamaua and the new threat to Lae forced a reassessment of priorities. Reports indicated that Salamaua's defensive perimeter had been compressed, its airfield and town area were badly damaged by bombing, and its capacity as a forward base was declining. At the same time, Lae and the Huon Peninsula remained essential for maintaining a foothold in northeastern New Guinea. The conclusion at higher command level was that Salamaua could no longer justify the continued expenditure of manpower and supplies. Adachi therefore ordered Nakano to withdraw the bulk of his forces from the Salamaua region to reinforce the defense of Lae. Estimates indicate that between 5,000 and 6,000 troops were evacuated by barge across the Huon Gulf, while other groups marched overland along the coast. Rear guards remained in place to delay the Allied advance and cover the removal of equipment where possible. For Japanese soldiers, this transition meant a rapid shift from months of static jungle defense to night marches and embarkations under the threat of air attack, with limited opportunity to move heavy weapons or large stores. On the Allied side, the same developments were interpreted as confirmation that the dual pressure strategy was working, as reports arrived that Japanese units were thinning out around Salamaua, New Guinea Force, and I Corps, command adjusted artillery targets and infantry tasks from methodical ridge clearing toward a more rapid push to secure the town and its airfield. Higher headquarters also began to shift some planning attention to the consolidation of Lae and future operations along the Huon Peninsula, viewing Salamaua increasingly as an objective whose value lay in how efficiently it could be taken, rather than in further attritional fighting. For soldiers in forward companies, the turning point was experienced less as a single moment than as a change in the character of contact. Patrols advancing after the fall of Charlie Hill encountered more abandoned positions and fewer prolonged stand-up engagements, although rearguard actions and booby traps still posed risks. Some Japanese positions were found empty, their occupants having withdrawn during the night, while others were held by small groups tasked with inflicting casualties before retreating. Allied units remained cautious, aware that reduced resistance could conceal ambushes or indicate that enemy forces were regrouping for a counterattack rather than leaving the area entirely. Local civilians observed the same shift in control. As Japanese units began moving northward in larger numbers and Allied patrols appeared more frequently near Salamaua's approaches, village leaders and families had to reassess where to seek relative safety. Some communities remained in place and saw one set of troops replaced by another. Others moved further inland or along lesser-used tracks, hoping to avoid renewed fighting. For carriers and guides working with either side, the turning point brought new routes and destinations, but did not reduce the physical demands or the risks associated with moving between front and rear areas. In this sense, the strategic decision to abandon Salamaua and concentrate on Lae fundamentally altered the military balance while leaving the human burdens of the campaign largely unchanged for those still on the ground. By early September 1943, the Allied approach to Salamaua had become a series of bounding advances rather than isolated ridge battles. Japanese rearguards, under orders to delay rather than hold at all costs, engaged advancing Australian and U.S. patrols with ambushes, short firefights, and preset explosive charges before breaking contact and moving toward prearranged evacuation points. Tracks that had been heavily defended months earlier were now marked by abandoned bunkers, ration tins, and occasional booby traps left to slow pursuit. As Allied battalions closed in on the town, artillery and airstrikes shifted from deep targets to the immediate defensive perimeter. Guns that had previously engaged Mount Tambu and Bobdoobie Ridge now fired on identified strongpoints close to Salamaua's airfield and waterfront. Medium bombers attacked suspected assembly areas and remaining supply dumps. This firepower, combined with the thinning of Japanese frontline units due to evacuation orders, reduced the likelihood of a final, large-scale defensive battle in the town itself. Instead, contact took the form of scattered resistance from small groups tasked with covering the withdrawal. On the Japanese side, the withdrawal unfolded in stages. Infantry companies and service units moved in groups toward coastal embarkation points, carrying light weapons and limited supplies. Heavy equipment that could not be moved by hand or loaded quickly onto barges was destroyed or abandoned. Embarkations took place at night, with craft dispersing to reduce losses from air attack. Some units marched overland along the coast toward Leh, accepting further strain on already exhausted troops in exchange for reduced exposure to Allied aircraft. Not all personnel were able to leave. Isolated groups became separated in the jungle, and wounded who could not be moved were left in makeshift shelters, where they were later found by Allied patrols. Allied entry into Salamaua in mid-September revealed the physical consequences of months of bombardment and occupation. The airstrip was cratered and obstructed, buildings were damaged or burnt, and wharves and storage sheds had been demolished or rendered unusable. Engineers and ordnance teams began clearing unexploded shells and mines, while infantry secured remaining pockets of resistance. Casualty figures for the final approach were lower than during the earlier ridge fighting, yet medical units continued to treat not only battle wounds, but also the accumulated effects of disease and exhaustion among long-serving companies. For the local population, the end of organized fighting around Salamaua did not immediately restore pre-war life. Many villages remained displaced, either because houses and gardens had been destroyed, or because the area was now used as a forward base. Some communities gradually returned to damaged lands, while others stayed in temporary locations established during the campaign. Colonial administrators and mission staff, where present, worked alongside military authorities to re-establish basic services, but resources were limited and priorities focused on the continuing war effort. In the immediate aftermath, Salamaua's value to the Allies was primarily logistical and symbolic. The town itself, heavily damaged and exposed to future air attack, was less suitable as a major base than the developing facilities around Leh and Nassau. However, its capture eliminated a Japanese foothold on Australian-administered territory that had been in enemy hands since early 1942, and it provided additional anchorage and staging capacity for smaller-scale operations along the Huon Gulf. Units that had fought through the ridges and coastal tracks were gradually withdrawn or reassigned, some moving on to participate in later stages of the New Guinea and New Britain campaigns. For Japanese forces who had retreated to Leh and beyond, the loss of Salamaua represented both a tactical adjustment and a sign of a shifting strategic balance. The troops evacuated from the town, strengthened Leh's garrison only briefly before subsequent Allied operations forced another withdrawal further up the coast and inland. The pattern of holding forward bases until they could no longer be sustained, then abandoning them to concentrate on new defensive lines, became a recurring feature of the campaign in northeastern New Guinea. In sum, the conclusion of direct fighting around Salamaua involved fewer large-scale clashes than earlier phases, but entailed significant movements of men and materiel, the clearing of a devastated town, and the redirection of effort toward the next objectives. The sector transitioned from an active front into a rear area for future operations, even as its civilian inhabitants and the surviving combatants on both sides dealt with the immediate consequences of a prolonged and attritional campaign. In the months after Salamaua fell on the 11th of September, 1943, commanders and historians began to assess what the long campaign around the town had achieved. Militarily, the Salamaua Drive and the Leh operation formed two halves of a single design. The sustained Allied pressure on Salamaua from April to September 1943 compelled the Japanese to commit and then evacuate significant elements of the 51st Division to and from a sector that was no longer decisive in itself. When the amphibious and airborne assaults on Leh took place in early September, the garrison there was weaker, more dispersed, and already under strain from continuous air attack and logistical shortages. Salamaua's capture, therefore, cannot be separated from the fall of Leh on the 16th of September and the subsequent Allied advances along the Huon Peninsula. The human cost of this outcome was considerable on all sides. According to post-war estimates, fighting in the Salamaua region between April and September 1943 caused about 1,083 Australian casualties, including 343 killed. Japanese forces suffered roughly 2,722 killed and 5,378 wounded in the Salamaua fighting, for a total of about 8,100 casualties. U.S. Army units, principally the 162nd Infantry Regiment, engaged around Nassau Bay and Tambu Bay, recorded 81 killed and 396 wounded in the same period. These battle figures do not include the many additional personnel evacuated because of malaria, other diseases, and non-battle injuries, which significantly reduced effective strength in most units. Strategically, the Salamaua sequence opened the way for further Allied operations in New Guinea. The capture of both towns provided airfields and anchorage areas that supported subsequent landings at Finschhafen and along the Huon Peninsula, and later moves into the Markham and Ramu valleys. Control of the Huon Gulf and the Vitiaz and Dampier Straits enabled Allied naval and air forces to impose an increasingly effective blockade on remaining Japanese bases in northeastern New Guinea. This, in turn, contributed to the broader Cartwheel objective of isolating Rabaul by cutting its sea and air connections, rather than attacking it directly. At the operational level, the Salamaua campaign highlighted several themes that influenced later planning. For the Allies, it demonstrated that coordinated use of amphibious landings, airborne operations, and inland advances could offset the disadvantages of jungle terrain and narrow tracks. The experiences of Nassau Bay and Nadzab informed the development of doctrine for future combined arms and joint service operations in the Southwest Pacific. At the same time, the campaign exposed persistent weaknesses, heavy dependence on indigenous carriers, vulnerability to disease, and difficulties in sustaining artillery and supply forward over ridgelines. These lessons were incorporated into subsequent operations but were never fully resolved, as later campaigns in New Guinea and the Philippines showed similar patterns of logistical strain. For Japanese forces, Salamaua illustrated both the strengths and limitations of their approach to defensive warfare in the Pacific. Well-sited bunkers, use of terrain, and readiness to conduct local counterattacks enabled comparatively small garrisons to delay larger Allied formations for months. However, the campaign also demonstrated that such defenses depended on supply lines that could be disrupted by air and naval interdiction, and that once higher command decided to abandon a forward base, the defenders had little capacity to extract heavy equipment or evacuate wounded. The withdrawal from Salamaua to Lae, and then further north, became part of a wider pattern of successive retreats along the New Guinea coast, under pressure from superior Allied mobility and firepower. The civilian legacy was more difficult to quantify, but was central to the long-term impact on the region. Villages around Salamaua, Wau, and the Huon Gulf had lost people to carrier service, displacement, and combat. Gardens and trade routes were disrupted or destroyed, and mission and administrative infrastructure that had connected local communities with the colonial government had been damaged or repurposed for military use. After the campaign, Australian civil authorities and churches sought to restore basic services, but reconstruction occurred alongside continued military use of some facilities and land. For many local families, the immediate post-campaign period involved rebuilding houses and gardens on ground that still bore unexploded ordnance and battlefield debris. In historical interpretation, Salamaua has often been overshadowed by more prominent operations, such as Kokoda, Bunagona, or later amphibious campaigns in the Philippines. Yet, within the New Guinea context, it occupies a distinct place as an example of how a relatively modest town became central to a strategy of diversion and attrition. The campaign's casualty figures, the length of the fighting, and the combination of inland and coastal operations have made it a case study in jungle warfare and coalition logistics. Military histories emphasize its role in drawing Japanese resources away from Lae, while some analyses question whether the extended duration of the Salamaua drive consumed Allied infantry and transport assets that might have been used elsewhere. For veterans and local inhabitants, memory of Salamaua has taken different forms. Australian and U.S. accounts frequently focus on specific battles, such as Lababia Ridge, Nassau Bay, Bob Doobie, and Mount Tambu, and on the physical challenges of operating in steep, waterlogged terrain under constant threat of disease. Japanese narratives often stress endurance, the difficulty of supply, and the gradual realization that earlier advances in New Guinea could not be sustained. Local oral histories emphasize the disruption of village life, the experience of serving as carriers or guides, and the long process of restoring agricultural and social patterns after the troops moved on. Together, these perspectives frame Salamaua not only as a step in a wider military campaign, but also as a shared environment in which different groups experience the same events in distinct but interrelated ways. In the broader history of the Pacific War, the Battle of Salamaua stands as an example of how operational decisions about relatively small places can influence the course of a theater-wide campaign. Its legacy lies less in a single decisive engagement than in the cumulative effects of months of fighting on terrain, logistics, troop strength, and local communities, and in the way these factors help shape the Allied advance that ultimately bypassed and isolated major Japanese bases in the Southwest Pacific.